A mysterious alien girl in a cage. Can he save her before it's too late? What if love could save the universe? What if it wasn't just about hearts beating, but about survival, choice, and sacrifice? What if the only thing standing between you and the end was an alien girl? Imagine this: the sun sets over a desolate, forgotten world. The wind howls through endless dunes, carrying secrets no one dares to speak. And there, in the middle of this barren wasteland, I found her locked in a cage, abandoned, with nothing but her tears. She wasn't human. She wasn't like anything I had ever seen. But something in her eyes, something deep within her silent pain, called out to me. I knew in that moment, I had to save her. But as I reached out to her, I realized this wasn't just about rescue. It was about a choice that would change everything. But here's the twist. What if saving her would cost me more than I'm ready to give? What if the truth she's hiding could destroy us both? Don't click away now. Stay with me, because this story will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, sacrifice, and fate. But here's the catch: watch until the end, and you'll uncover secrets that will blow your mind. Oh, and if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. I'll be waiting for you at the finish line. Raiden walked across the barren desert, his boots kicking up sand with every step. The sky stretched endlessly above, a dull gray, almost suffocating. His breath was steady, but the heat was relentless. Every footstep felt like an eternity. He had learned to live with the silence out here. The isolation, the emptiness. But today, something was different. There was a disturbance in the air. A pull he couldn't ignore. He saw it before he felt it. A glint in the distance, barely visible against the vast desert. He slowed his pace, eyes narrowing. The wreckage was too familiar, too intentional. It wasn't just debris. It was something else. Something that shouldn't have been left behind. As he approached, the outline of a cage came into focus. A rusted transport cell, used by Syndicate to move prisoners. The kind that sent a chill down your spine. But this one wasn't being used for prisoners anymore. No, it had become a tomb. Inside, curled in the far corner, was a body. A woman, though not human. She was small, fragile, almost unrecognizable under the weight of her injuries. Her skin was pale green, faintly glowing under the harsh light. Her hair, long strands of sapphire blue, stuck to her skin, as if the very air had turned against her. Raiden stopped dead in his tracks. His heart raced. He wanted to turn away, to ignore the broken body in front of him. But he couldn't. He couldn't shake the feeling. The one that told him she wasn't just another casualty. She was something more. He stepped forward, the sand shifting beneath him. His fingers gripped the rusted bars of the cage. The lock was old, worn, but still functional. He twisted it without a sound. It fell open with ease, as if it had been waiting for him. For this moment. For her. He didn't open the door at once. He paused. Took a deep breath. His pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. She wasn't dead, but she was close. Too close. He reached inside, slowly, carefully. He unbuckled his shirt and gently draped it over her, the fabric falling softly against her fragile form. For a moment, nothing happened. She didn't flinch. Didn't even stir. Then, the faintest breath. Her fingers twitched. A soft, hesitant movement. Raiden's breath hitched. He didn't know why, but he couldn't leave her there. He couldn't just walk away. He opened the door, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Still, she didn't move. He crouched beside her, lifting her carefully, cradling her in his arms. She was light. Too light. He could feel the heat of her skin, like a fever burning her from the inside out. She didn't resist. Didn't even try to fight. She was a lifeless rag doll, abandoned by the very world that created her. The desert stretched before him, endless and unforgiving. But he didn't care. Not anymore. He had to get her out. He had to get them both out. No one could be left behind like this. Not again. As he carried her back to the outpost, the twin suns beat down mercilessly. The weight of her in his arms was heavy, but it wasn't her body that burdened him. It was the memory of the last time he had been too late. The last time he had failed. He wouldn't fail again. The outpost came into view, a rusted shell of a ship, half buried in the sand. Ugly, but sturdy enough. For now, it would have to be their refuge. Raiden didn't have time to rest. He couldn't afford to. Not yet. The weight of the woman in his arms was still burning into him, a reminder of everything he had failed to protect. He carried her through the outpost's narrow hallways, the walls breathing with the hum of the ship's failing systems. The air felt stale, but it was better than the desert. For now. He laid her down on the makeshift bed, his hands shaking for a moment before he steadied himself. She was still unconscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Raiden felt the heat radiating off her skin. He needed to cool her down, get her hydrated, but there was something else, something gnawing at the back of his mind. He couldn't ignore it. The door slid open with a hiss, and Raiden turned. Kira stood in the doorway, her face tense, her eyes dark. Her gaze flickered to Alya, then back to Raiden. The words she had spoken the night before echoed in his mind, the warning, the hesitation in her voice. "You brought her here?" Kira asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Raiden nodded, still standing next to the bed, unable to look away from Alya's fragile form. "She's not a threat, Kira. She needs help." Kira's expression hardened. "You don't get it, do you?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. "She's not just some alien. She's a ticking bomb. And you're carrying her right into the heart of the Syndicate." Raiden felt the anger rise, a fire building in his chest. He clenched his fists, but his words were steady. "I'm not leaving her. She's not some experiment for them to use. She's a person. And I'm not abandoning her." Kira's face twisted in frustration, but there was something else there, something deeper. She moved closer, lowering her voice. "You think I don't see it, Raiden? You think I don't know what you're doing?" Her words were quieter now, laced with something almost familiar. "You're falling for her." Raiden's breath caught in his throat. He didn't respond at first, not sure how to. It wasn't that simple. Was it? No. It couldn't be. Kira stepped back, shaking her head. "This isn't a rescue mission. This is personal." She sighed, running a hand through her messy hair. "We're in too deep. And now you're dragging us both down with her." Raiden glanced at Alya, her small frame resting so still on the bed. He had to do something. He couldn't go back. Not now. "I'm doing what's right," he said, more to himself than to Kira. She turned away, her back to him, staring at the cracked walls of the outpost. Right? You call this right? We're already wanted men, Raiden. You're leading us straight into their hands. Raiden felt the weight of Kira's words. But his resolve didn't waver. If I'm going to die, I'm not doing it alone. He paused, his voice barely a whisper. She's not alone either. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a storm. Kira didn't turn back, but Raiden could feel her eyes on him, weighing him, judging him. I'm not leaving you, he repeated, his voice low but firm. Not this time. Raiden sat in the dimly lit corner of the outpost, staring at the flickering screen in front of him. The data from Alya's body was streaming through, but it made no sense. The patterns were chaotic, unlike anything he'd ever seen. Her vitals were stable for now, but the readings on her neural activity were impossible. Alya stirred in the bed behind him, the soft rustle of fabric the only sound in the room. Raiden's heart skipped a beat. He stood up, turning toward her, but she was still unconscious. Her body, though pale and fragile, seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't understand. The more he observed her, the more certain he became there was something in her, something that went beyond biology. Something otherworldly. She had to be part of the Syndicate's Project Genesis, a biogenetic experiment designed to manipulate and control alien species. That much, Raiden could guess. But there was more. The way her mind reacted to the environment, how her body responded to external stimuli, it wasn't just about survival. She was different. He took a step forward, his heart beating faster. Alya's eyes fluttered open, slowly. She blinked, her pupils dilating as she focused on him. Her breathing was shallow at first, but she wasn't afraid. At least, not of him. For a moment, there was silence. A heavy, almost unbearable silence. Then, her voice, weak but clear, broke through. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice cracked, like she hadn't used it in a long time. Raiden didn't know how to answer. What could he say? That he was a soldier, exiled for making the wrong choice? That he was running away, just like she was? Instead, he simply said, "I'm Raiden." She frowned, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes. "Raiden. I remember you." Her words seemed distant, unsure. But there was something in the way she spoke, something that felt like a promise. He stepped closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. "You're safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." She didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to the small window of the outpost, where the two suns hung in the sky like distant gods. Her expression hardened, the once fragile woman now filled with an intensity that unnerved him. "Safe?" Alya's voice was a bitter laugh. "What does that even mean anymore? You can't hide from them forever. From the Syndicate. From what I am." Raiden's throat tightened. She knew. She knew what she was. He wasn't sure if she was ready to confront the truth, but it was coming. He could see it in her eyes. She was too aware, too sharp to stay ignorant for long. "Tell me," he asked, his voice barely a whisper, "what are you?" Alya's eyes flickered with pain, but also something deeper. Something that Raiden couldn't name. "I'm a product. A weapon. Created to be used. To predict. To control." She paused, taking a shuddering breath. "But I don't want that. I never asked for this. I never asked for them to make me like this." Raiden reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Her skin was still warm, but there was a chill to it, as if the part of her that was human was fighting against the part that wasn't. She flinched, but didn't pull away. "I won't let them take you," Raiden said, his voice low and steady. "I'll protect you. We'll figure this out, together." Alya's eyes softened for a moment, but her expression quickly turned hard again. "You don't understand. I'm not human. I never was." Her words hit him like a blow. He stepped back, trying to steady himself. It wasn't just the physical scars she carried, the ones that marked her skin, the ones that made her look so fragile. It was the soul of her, the one that had been twisted by the hands of those who'd created her. "We all have our pasts," he said, his voice rough. "Doesn't matter what you were. What matters is what you choose to be now." Alya stared at him, silent for a long moment. Then, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I am anymore. But I know I don't want to be their weapon. I want to choose for myself." Raiden nodded, his heart aching. He could feel the weight of her words, the gravity of her struggle. It was more than just survival now. It was about freedom. About reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her. And he was going to help her do that, no matter the cost. The silence in the outpost was oppressive. Raiden leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, staring at the maps and data sprawled out before him. The dim light from the overhead panel flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Kira had gone silent after their last conversation, her doubts now clearly etched in every line of her face. He couldn't blame her. She wasn't wrong about one thing, they were already in too deep. But turning back was never an option. Alya stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the twin suns were starting their descent. There was something distant in her expression, like she was already lost in thought, somewhere far beyond the confines of the small outpost. Raiden could feel the weight of her presence, the strange, almost unsettling energy that clung to her. He didn't know if it was the project inside her, or if it was simply the toll of everything she had endured. She broke the silence, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "We don't have much time." Raiden looked up, his eyes meeting hers. She was already looking at him, her eyes steady, calculating. There was no fear in her gaze, just a quiet resolve. The same resolve that had been there when he found her. The same resolve that would carry them both through the storm they were about to face. "No," he replied, standing up straight. "We don't." The escape plan was simple, but dangerous. They had to infiltrate the Syndicate's central hub, the heart of the empire that had created Alya, and steal the data that could expose everything. Project Genesis, the truth about Alya's creation, and the experiments that had been carried out. If they succeeded, they could shut down Syndicate's control over the galactic military and free not just Alya, but others like her. But the risks were high. If they were caught, if Syndicate found out what they were planning, it wouldn't just be the end of their mission. It would be the end of them. Raiden turned toward Kira, who was hunched over a console, her fingers flying across the keys. "You've got the entry codes?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Kira didn't look up. "I've got them. But this is a one-way ticket, Raiden. Once we go in, there's no turning back." Raiden nodded. "I know. And I'm not turning back." There was a long pause before Kira spoke again. "I know you're doing this for her. For the right reasons. But don't think I don't see the way you're looking at her. It's dangerous, Raiden. You're crossing a line." He didn't answer at first. He didn't have to. She was right. But he wasn't in this just for Alya. He was in this because it was the only thing that felt right anymore. The only fight worth fighting. "Let's get this done," he said, his tone final. "We don't have time for second guesses." Alya stepped forward, breaking her silence. "We'll need to move fast. The Syndicate won't let us get away with this." Raiden looked at her, his gaze softening just for a moment. "We'll make it out, I promise." But as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. The air was thick with tension as the escape plan unfolded. They moved swiftly through the shadows, silent as ghosts. Raiden's heartbeat echoed in his ears, a constant reminder of what was at stake. His hand brushed against Alya's as they navigated the narrow corridors of the Syndicate base. Her skin was warm, and for a fleeting moment, he felt her presence, steadying him, grounding him. He glanced at her. She was focused, her expression unreadable, yet there was something in the way she held herself, something vulnerable underneath the calm exterior. She was still carrying the weight of everything she had endured, everything she had been made to be. And now, with every step, they were moving toward the truth. Toward a future where she could finally be free. Alya turned to him, her eyes meeting his for the briefest of moments. A flicker of something deeper than the mission, something that couldn't be ignored. "I'm scared," she said quietly, her voice barely a whisper. "What if we don't make it?" Raiden paused, his fingers tightening around his weapon. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice was steady. "We will. We have to. Not just for us, but for everyone else they've hurt." Her gaze softened, the walls around her cracking just a little. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore, Raiden. I was made to be used. To be controlled. Now I'm trying to be something else." Raiden stepped closer, his presence close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body. He reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You don't have to be anyone else. You're already enough. More than enough." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for something reassurance, maybe a promise. Slowly, as if testing the waters, she placed her hand over his, letting the warmth of her touch spread through him. They stood like that for a moment, just two people in the dark, finding solace in each other's presence, a brief moment of peace in a world that had offered them none. But their moment was short-lived. The soft hum of a distant patrol drone cut through the silence, and the reality of their situation returned in full force. Raiden's hand dropped from hers, and the urgency returned. They had no time for weakness. They had a mission to complete. "Let's go," he said, his voice low but filled with determination. They pushed forward, through the labyrinthine halls, deeper into the heart of Syndicate's stronghold. Alya was beside him, her steps measured, but her presence next to him felt like more than just an ally. She felt like a partner. Like something more than the mission itself. Raiden's mind raced. The conflict inside him was growing harder to ignore. He had come into this fight with a single purpose, to do what was right, to save someone who had been left behind. But now, as their hands brushed again, as their eyes met once more, he realized it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about her. About the connection between them that was impossible to ignore. Alya seemed to feel it too. She glanced at him, her lips curling into a soft smile, almost imperceptible, but there. Her eyes sparkled with a light that hadn't been there before. Hope. Maybe, for the first time, they both had something to fight for that went beyond survival. The corridor was bathed in red light, an emergency warning flashing across the walls. Raiden's pulse quickened. They were close. Too close. The central data core was just ahead, and the final phase of their plan was nearly in motion. But there was something else, something that felt off. He could feel the tension in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Alya was moving beside him, her steps light but purposeful. She had her focus, her attention fixed on the mission ahead. But Raiden could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She wasn't just afraid of the Syndicate, she was afraid of what this mission meant for her. For them both. "They're closing in," Alya whispered, her voice low, barely audible over the hum of the approaching patrols. "We don't have much time." Raiden nodded, adjusting the weapon on his back. "We don't need much time. We just need to get to that core." Alya's gaze shifted to the dimly lit hallway in front of them. Her fingers brushed against the panel on the wall, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. "In," she said, stepping through. They entered the control room, where rows of terminals hummed with activity. The space was cold, sterile, and utterly devoid of life, save for the glowing data screens. Raiden's eyes scanned the room quickly. They had no time to waste. He turned to Alya. "Do it." She nodded, moving to the nearest terminal. Her fingers flew across the keys, the display lighting up in response to her touch. Raiden kept a watchful eye on the door, every second ticking by faster than he could count. Then, the alarm blared. A deep, resounding sound that echoed through the halls. Raiden's breath caught in his throat. They had been discovered. "They know," Raiden said, his voice sharp with urgency. Alya didn't flinch. Her hands moved faster, her expression one of concentration and determination. "I'm almost there," she replied. But even as she spoke, the door behind them slid open with a clanking sound, and heavy boots echoed through the hall. Raiden stepped in front of Alya instinctively, his rifle at the ready. His pulse hammered in his chest, but there was no fear. Not anymore. They were too close to turn back now. A group of Syndicate soldiers entered, their weapons raised. Their leader, a tall man with dark glasses and a cold smile, stepped forward. His voice was calm, too calm. "You've made a mistake, soldier," he said, his tone dripping with venom. "You should have stayed out of this. It's too late for you." Raiden didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the leader. "No. It's not too late. For any of us." Alya stood behind him, her hands still on the terminal, but she was no longer focused on the data. She was watching, her gaze steely, her body tense. Raiden could feel the power of her presence even without looking directly at her. The leader smirked. "You think you can escape? You think you can just walk away from this?" Raiden's hand tightened on the rifle, and for the first time, his voice faltered. "I don't need to escape," he said, stepping forward. "I'm already gone." Before the leader could react, the sound of a gunshot rang out, followed by the shattered sound of glass. Raiden's heart raced, his instincts kicking in as he dropped to the ground, taking cover behind a nearby console. The soldiers reacted quickly, scrambling for cover, but Raiden wasn't waiting. He fired, the weapon in his hands steady, the shots clean. He moved fluidly enough to avoid the chaos but not slow enough to lose his edge. Another shot, another down. The soldiers, once coordinated and precise, were now scattered. Raiden could feel his focus sharpen as the adrenaline surged through him. Alya's voice cut through the noise. Raiden, behind you. He turned just in time to see a soldier coming at him, a blade weapon raised. Without thinking, Raiden lunged forward, disarming the man in a fluid motion and knocking him to the ground. He didn't waste time. A quick, precise shot ended the fight. The rest of the soldiers hesitated for a moment. Alya's fingers danced over the terminal once more, and the room fell silent. The Syndicate's data, everything was in her hands. Raiden's breath came heavy, his hands still gripping the rifle. He looked over at Alya, his gaze softening for a split second. She had done it. They had done it. But the battle wasn't over. Not yet. Let's move, he said, his voice steady but urgent. Alya stood up, her eyes meeting his. Her body was tense, but there was a glimmer of something in her eyes. A resolve. A strength she hadn't shown before. They both knew the danger wasn't over. But for the first time in what felt like forever, Raiden didn't feel alone. He had her. She had him. And together, they would face whatever came next. The storm was over. The chaos, the gunfire, the shouting, they all faded into the distance as Raiden and Alya made their way through the wreckage. The weight of the mission was finally starting to settle in, but there was no time to linger. The Syndicate's forces were scattered, but they wouldn't stay down for long. They would come after them. Raiden moved ahead, his rifle still in hand, but his steps were lighter now. It was done. The data was secured. The truth about Project Genesis would be exposed, and Alya's future, her freedom, was within reach. But even as they moved through the rubble, Raiden could feel the question hanging between them. What now? They reached the outer door, the wind outside biting at their skin. The twin suns were sinking below the horizon, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. It was beautiful in its own way. Silent. Endless. But there was a feeling here, an unspoken weight. A new beginning. A chance to leave behind everything that had held them captive. Alya stopped for a moment, her eyes scanning the open desert. The quiet had settled in, but there was no peace in it. She could feel the eyes of the world still on her, the weight of what she had been, what she had been made to be. You still don't trust me, do you? Raiden's voice cut through the silence, soft but sure. Alya turned to him, her face unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Something that had shifted between them over the course of their journey. Something that said more than words ever could. No, she replied, her voice low. I trust you. Raiden's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought he imagined it. But he saw it there, in her eyes. The connection. The bond that had formed between them. It wasn't about promises. It wasn't about who had saved whom. It was something more. Something they had built together. Then let's go, Raiden said, his voice steady now. He stepped forward, gesturing for her to follow. And this time, she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, too, walking beside him into the unknown. The winds howled around them as they made their way across the barren landscape, their figures silhouetted against the fading light. They didn't look back. There was nothing left for them there. Nothing but the remnants of a life they had never chosen. They walked together, side by side, as if the rest of the world had disappeared. The stars above them seemed to burn brighter than ever before, a sign of the new life that awaited them. Alya glanced at Raiden as they walked. She didn't speak, but there was something in the way she looked at him, gratitude, trust, and something deeper. something that only they could understand. Raiden's hand brushed against hers again, this time without hesitation. She didn't pull away. Instead, she held his hand, and together, they walked on, their path uncertain but their resolve clear. For the first time in a long while, Raiden felt like he was where he was supposed to be. Not fighting for survival, not running from the past, but walking forward into the unknown with someone who had become his equal. Someone who had fought with him, bled with him, and had come to mean more than just a mission. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And together, they would face whatever came next. They say the greatest battles we fight are within ourselves. But what if the battle is for someone else? What if love is the weapon? In the end, it wasn't the syndicate, the aliens, or even the endless desert that nearly destroyed us. It was the choice. The choice between leaving her behind or risking everything to set her free. And let me tell you, sometimes, the hardest part of being a hero is knowing that the hero's journey never ends. I thought we were running from the past. I thought we were escaping the chaos, the danger. But what I didn't realize, the greatest escape of all was the one I made from myself. From the pain. From the walls I had built around my heart. And in that moment, standing beside her Alya, I understood. Love doesn't save you. It saves us. Now, the question is, what's next for us? For me? For her? We've made it this far. But are we ready for what comes after the storm? If you've stayed with me till now, you know this isn't the end. It's just the beginning. So, subscribe now, because this journey's far from over. Drop a comment, share your thoughts, let's talk about what happens next. You won't want to miss the twist coming soon. Trust me, we're just getting started.